Hi, I'm Griff, and this video records my attempt to walk a 5.5 mile section of the Wales coastal path in the Vale of Glamorgan, southeast Wales in April 2019. The section is on the Glamorgan Heritage Coast from Marcross to Southerndown. This is part of my quest to navigate every section of the Wales coast by walking it and cycling it and kayaking it. The Welsh Coast is about 870 miles or 1,400 kilometres long. My goal is to walk every section of the Wales coastal path and kayak every section of the Welsh Coast and cycle every section of the Welsh Coast. It's a huge undertaking, and I hope that my dodgy knees hold out long enough for me to complete it. I am recording every journey that I make exploring each and every section of the Wales coast in this YouTube channel. So join me on this video to see how I got on traversing this stunning section of the Glamorgan Heritage Coast and whether we were able to complete the walk before sunset. See what bus we got to the start point, what pubs we called in, the towering cliffs of the Wales Jurassic Coast, the magnificent Nash Point Lighthouse, and learn about the wonderful history of the Glamorgan Heritage Coast. Starting at Marcross, we walked about 3/4 mile down the road to Nash Point to join the Wales coastal path. We then walked westwards along the cliff tops, dipping down into 3 small valleys called Cwm Nash, Cwm Bach and Cwm Mawr. We then walked over Trwnewich Headland before dropping down into Dunraven Bay, and finally we climbed up to Southerndown village itself. We parked up on the main road about 300 metres west of the 3 Golden Cups, a busy pub in the village of Southerndown. The 303 bus heading eastwards stops the same side of the road as the 3 Golden Cups. It's a super useful bus service for this section of the coast. It took about 20 minutes or so for the bus journey to Marcross. The 303 bus route shown covers the western 2/3 of the Vale of Glamorgan coast, and it's really useful for hiking or kayaking this part of the coast. I've marked up with red circles the bus stops that we used for our walk, at Southerndown on the left and Marcross on the right. We got off at the bus stop by the Horseshoe Inn at Marcross. The Horseshoe Inn is a nice pub with a large beer garden to the side. I've had food here before and it was very good. The interior of the pub is quite oldie-worldy and it has a lot of character. It has a pretty good selection of beers too. I always try to get a bus, train or taxi out to the start point of a walk and then hike back to the end point. I much prefer to do linear walks than circular walks, which often involve backtracking. The 303 bus stops right by the Horseshoe Inn at Marcross, and it's about 3/4 mile or so from here down the lane to the Wales coastal path at Nash Point. Marcross is therefore another good location to start or end a walk for this section of the coast. There are some earthworks on the northeast side of the village of Marcross, which are the remains of a medieval monastic grange. We headed down the lane from the Horseshoe Inn at Marcross towards Nash Point. The lane is fairly quiet traffic-wise, but it is narrow, so you will have to move to the side when cars do come through. At the end of it is a car park which serves Nash Point Lighthouse, which is a focal point of this part of the coast. We passed the Holy Trinity Church at Marcross on the way down the lane. The main structure dates from the 12th century. If you would rather walk off-road, Then there is a footpath which runs parallel to the road from Marcross to Nash Point. We decided to walk down the road because it is a bit quicker than going off-road, and we were trying to get to Southerndown before it got dark. For those of you not familiar with the Vale of Glamorgan, many of the roads in the Vale are relatively narrow. It's a historic area with numerous small villages which are often linked by narrow, winding roads. The lighthouse at Nash Point, at the end of the lane down from Marcross, was the last manned lighthouse in Wales. The last lighthouse keeper is left in 1998. The lighthouse itself was built in 1882 and 83 to warn ships away from the treacherous sandbanks and rocks off of Nash Point. The lane down to Nash Point overlooks Cwm Marcross, the valley that runs from the beach up to Marcross village. On the other side of the valley, we could see the Welsh coastal path climb west along the route that we would be taking. Although this section of the path is mostly fairly flat, some of the descents into and ascents out of the small valleys which intersect the path can be quite steep and will certainly get the blood flowing. The tide was low when we did our walk, exposing much of the sand and rocks at the base of the cliffs. If you wanted to park at the car park at Nash Point itself, then you can of course still use the 303 bus to take you west or east to save you having to do a circular walk back to Nash Point. It just means that you'd have to get on or off the bus 3/4 of a mile up the lane at Marcross and then walk back to the car at Nash Point. This is the small cafe at Nash Point car park. Nash Point is known primarily for its splendid lighthouse which sits out on the point itself. We did not walk down to the lighthouse on this occasion because our walk took us westwards from Nash Point, whereas the lighthouse is about 1/3 of a mile to the east down towards the end of the point. The lighthouse's construction is said to have been spurred by the wreck of the Frolic on the Nash Sands in March 1831, resulting in over 50 deaths. These are photos of the Nash Point Lighthouse that I took on a later walk when we did the section east from Nash Point, and it really is quite a splendid structure and worth visiting if you are walking this part of the coast. I've also dropped in some video footage of the lighthouse from my kayak of this section that I did a couple of years later. I even took a selfie with the lighthouse in the background to prove to my kayaking friends that I had kayaked around Nash Point, because they wouldn't have believed me otherwise. Looking back east to Nash Point, we could see the white tower of the lighthouse gleaming in the sun. From the car park at Nash Point, we headed west and dropped down into the valley which runs down to Nash Point Beach. The coastal path drops down from Nash Point into this valley and crosses a stream. Climbing up the other side, we were on lofty cliffs overlooking the Bristol Channel, a terrain which is very common to this part of the Wales coastal path. We trekked the coastal path westward along the top of these fine cliffs, occasionally being left weak-kneed by how close the path runs to the edge of the cliffs. I am not particularly good with heights. Most of this part of the coast between Ogmore by Sea in the west all the way to Penarth in the east is largely comprised of tall cliffs with fine views over the Bristol Channel, although technically at around or about Lavernock Point near Penarth, the Bristol Channel becomes the Severn Estuary. Digressing slightly, the Vale of Glamorgan generally is itself a great area for walking, and not just in terms of the coastal path. It has a lot of quaint villages scattered across it, connected with a good network of paths. Roughly in the centre of the Vale of Glamorgan is the nice old market town of Cowbridge, a historic, well-to-do small town. One of the best things about this section of the Wales coastal path is that for most of the time you have fine views across the Bristol Channel towards Somerset and Devon. On a clear day, you can see the Devon and Somerset shorelines very clearly. From this point, it is about 14 to 15 miles across the Devon and Somerset, but it always looks a lot closer than that for some reason. As you can see, it was a hot and sunny spring day, something of a heat wave for this time of the year. Another time warp to cover more ground. The stretch between Nash Point and Cumnash Valley is a flat section about 1 mile long. On our right, the rich farmland of the Vale of Glamorgan rolled inland to the horizon. Many of the fields were lush with spring crops. We could see the small hamlets of Monknash and Borton nestling in amongst the gently rolling landscape. Monknash is the home to one of my favourite Vale of Glamorgan pubs, the Plough and Harrow, a historic country inn with a great beer garden out the front and a good selection of beers and ciders. Monknash is another good stopping off point, or a good starting or finishing point, on this section of the coastal path. It is also served by the 303 bus, the same one that we had caught from Southerndown to Marcross for our walk today. Well, it wouldn't be a proper vlog without some selfie footage, would it? I was certainly glad I remembered my sunglasses today. This was a nice section of the coastal path to walk, most of it being comprised of gently undulating cliff tops broken up now and again by narrow valleys which cut their way down to the coast. The vista out to sea was dominated by expansive views across the Bristol Channel to Somerset and Devon. In terms of possible alternative options for this walk, one option could be extending the walk. The walk that we did was about 5.5 miles long, so it was a relatively short one. If you wanted to do a longer walk, then you could start or stop from the other villages where the 303 bus stops, either to the west or east of our route. It really depends how far you want to walk. Walking along the beach instead of the cliff tops is another option for this section. Whilst walking on the beaches would be possible, at least for some sections of the walk, it may be very difficult because the beaches are so rocky in parts. It would be slow going on the beaches in many sections, and you would need to be very careful not to get trapped by the tide if the tide was coming in, because it often comes right up to the cliffs themselves on a very high tide. Otherwise, you could find yourself being subject to an early and unscheduled bath halfway through your walk, so it's better to keep to the cliff tops. We came across the second of the several small valleys that we would cross, Cumnash. The other thing you notice when the tide is out on this section is how treacherous this part of the coast is, with fast tides and lots of sandbanks. It's little wonder that they built a lighthouse at Nash Point to warn ships away from the sandbanks, which lay off of the point. When you visit the beach at Cumnash, you can apparently look up to the small cliff face to the west, and you may even see some bones poking out. These cliff tops are thought to be a burial site for both the local community and tragic shipwreck victims during the 1500s and 1600s. Although badly damaged, the ancient bones were discovered after fierce storms caused the cliffs to collapse, revealing long-forgotten graves. As we descended down into Cumnash Valley, I wish I'd brought my trusty walking poles with me. Cumnash runs from the village of Monknash down to the pebbly Monknash beach. If you want a detour up to Monknash village to call into the previously mentioned Plough and Harrow pub, then it's about 3/4 of a mile walk up the valley. Another option could be to park at Monknash Beach car park, which is only about 1/3 of a mile up Cumnash. This walk is one of my many other walks that I'm doing in my quest to walk the entire 870 miles of the Wales coastal path. Based upon my average walk being about 8 to 10 miles long, what with me not being very fit and having dodgy knees, this results in the total number of walks required to complete the entire path being about 100 walks. That's quite an undertaking, but I'm determined to finish it. Climbing out of Cumnash, I was glad that it had been dry recently, so the path was not too muddy. Cwm is the Welsh word for a wooded valley, so it crops up a lot in Welsh place names, and Cumnash would therefore roughly translate as Nash Valley in English. The nearby village of Monknash apparently had a strong connection to the church. Monksnash was a grange, an outlying church-owned farm which supplied food to the Cistercian Abbey at Neath. The remains of the grange can still be seen around the village of Monknash. This strange little structure was presumably some sort of animal shelter. We had a long-awaited lunch stop on the cliff tops on the west side of Monknash Beach before plodding on westwards towards Southerndown in our attempt to reach there before it got too dark. After climbing up the slope from the west side of Cumnash Valley, the path levelled off again for another long stretch across the cliff tops. While getting close to the edges of the cliffs gave us amazing views along the coast, we obviously had to be careful not to get too close. My circumnavigation of the Wales coast by walking, kayaking and cycling it has taken me to parts of Wales that I've not previously been to before, despite the fact that I've lived most of my life in South Wales. What never ceases to amaze me is the different perspective that you get when you walk, cycle or kayak the same section of coast, since each mode of travelling gives you a different perspective of that part of the coast. Another option for traversing this section of the coast is of course kayaking it. I would caveat my comments on kayaking any section of the Wales coast in southeast Wales with the proviso that it's quite tidal in parts and can be subject to strong currents. I have kayaked this section of the coast. In fact, my kayak was a few miles longer than this walk was because I started further east at Lantwit Beach and kayaked to Southerndown with the tide going out, which was about 6.5 miles. You get a very different perspective from a kayak looking back from the sea towards the cliffs. The sea around Nash Point has sandbanks which result in that stretch of water often becoming very rough, other than about 1 to 2 hours either side of high tide. On the South Wales coast generally, when the tide is going out, it will run east to west, and when the tide is coming in, then it will run west to east. So you obviously have to factor this into your kayak. The other main factor to allow for when kayaking is of course the wind direction, together with the amount of swell and how rough the sea is. As well as assembling videos of all of my walks, bike rides and kayaks around the Welsh coast, I also have a website at www.griffoutdoors.com where you can read blogs and see photos and other videos of my exploration of the Welsh coastline. Here are some photos and also some video footage of a kayak of this section that I did a couple of years later. They illustrate the different perspective you get of the coast when looking back from the sea on a kayak compared to walking the shoreline. I live in Neath, which is about 30 to 50 minutes away from the various locations which can be used as start or end points for walks down the Vale of Glamorgan, so this was a fairly localish walk for me. Apparently the tidal range here is the second highest in the world after the Bay of Fundy in Canada, and you certainly do get different vistas as you gaze out over the cliffs, depending on whether the tide is in or out. It's strange to think that when I kayaked this section of the coast a couple of years later, I stopped for a break at the foot of these same cliffs almost directly below where I was now standing. I had heard that the cliffs could be subject to common rockfalls, but hadn't paid much attention to it until I heard the rocks crashing down not far from me on that occasion. I recall deciding to move rather sharply away from the foot of the cliffs as I ate my sandwiches on the narrow shingle beach. This panorama illustrates the expansiveness of the cliffs which run almost unbroken between Ogmore by Sea in the west to Penarth in the east. There are many local tales of smugglers and wreckers who would lure vessels onto rocks, attack the crew and loot the cargo. On stormy nights, wreckers would attach lanterns to the grazing sheep on the cliff tops, giving the illusion that they were sailing in safe waters when in fact they were on course to rocky shores. The cliffs of this coastline are very popular for fossil hunting. It's known as the Welsh Jurassic Coast. If you do go fossil hunting here, watch out for the rockfalls though, and also be sure that you are not cut off by the tide. No signs of anybody swimming in the sea, but it was only April and the sea temperature was probably still fairly arctic. I do a lot of sea swimming these days now that I have my O'Neill 7mm winter wetsuit. I'm something of a wuss and feel the cold, so I wear my winter wetsuit even in the summer when I go sea swimming. Looking inland, the views over the rich farmland of the Vale of Glamorgan were as equally as pleasing to the eye as the cliffs. I do have a soft spot for the Vale, as we call it in South Wales. It certainly has some of the most attractive farmland in Wales, much of which has a similar feel to it as you often find down South Gower and parts of South Pembrokeshire, which are other areas which were heavily settled during the Norman invasion of South Wales back in the early medieval period. The regular hourly bus service offered by the 303 bus and the fine pubs at the small villages are the icing on the cake when it comes to evaluating the Vale as a hiking area. It's a relatively easy section of the Wales coastal path to do from a logistical and terrain point of view. We started to get our first views of Southerndown village just about coming into view to the west, giving us hope that we could get there before sunset. The white buildings of Southerndown clung to the cliff tops on the horizon. These spectacular cliffs were created from layers and layers of limestone and shale over millions of years, their sheer faces having been carved from a constant battering by the sea. More great views over the cliffs here. As we approached Cumbrac Valley, we neared where the Wales coastal path intersects with the Valeways Millennium Heritage Trail, a circular route of historical interest. You could take the Valeways Millennium Heritage Trail from the village of Monknash, where you could then drop down Cumbrac Valley to the coast, walk along the Wales coastal path, turn up Cumbrac Valley, and come back along the road to Monknash for some food and maybe a beer or cider at the historic Plough and Harrow pub in Monknash. This is Cumbach Little Valley, which runs up towards the quaint village of Wick. While the cliff top sections are quite flat, the valleys which intersect this part of the coast often involve quite steep slopes into them and out of them. Traversing these small valleys usually involves a small detour inland, as was the case with Cumbach. It seems that this is simply to reduce the gradient of the slope of the path, since if you went straight up and down the valley sides like a Roman road, then it would involve the path going up and down gradients only traversable by a mountain goat. You could cut up Cumbach for about 1.5 miles to Wick, a nice village with a couple of good pubs, and which is also on the route of the 303 bus. After climbing out of Cumbach Valley, we had a breather while taking in more stunning views of the cliffs before continuing westwards towards Southerndown. Walking along cliff tops in the dark is never advisable, and I have had to do that once on a walk down Pembrokeshire when we managed to get way behind schedule. The Welsh coastal path is about 870 miles long in total, and about 38 miles of it runs through the Glamorgan Heritage Coast. Like the sirens of ancient Greek mythology, the views of the sea kept luring me towards the cliff edges and my potential destruction. I have walked much of the Wales coastal path, and the Vale of Glamorgan I think is one of the best sections for cliff top views that I have come across. Stopping to view the cliffs on this walk was always a good excuse to have a breather. We were by now about 2/3 of the way through the walk. Trwnewich headland started to loom closer, like a beacon signalling that we were nearing Dunraven Bay and Southerndown. After a further trek westwards, we came across the last valley to be traversed, Cwm Mawr, meaning large valley. This involved the path descending through a delightful old woodland festooned with bluebells. This reminded me of other similar woodlands that I've encountered in other sections of the Wales coastal path, such as in South Gower and South Pembrokeshire. The path crossed a small wooden bridge over a stream at the bottom of the valley before climbing out the other side. Cwm Mawr was more heavily wooded than the other valleys that we passed over on the route. We climbed out of Cwm Mawr along a hedge-lined pathway and back up onto the cliff-top plateaus. Cycling the cliff tops of this section of the path would be very tricky indeed. Other than the road from Marcross down to Nash Point, none of this section was tarmac. However, since the track is only designated as a footpath and not as a cycle route, it would technically be an offence to cycle on them in any event. It really depends how far you want to cycle, but one suggested route for cycling this part of this coast could be starting at Nash Point and cycling about 11.5 miles to the wonderful Iweni Priory and then cycling back. That would be about 23 miles return cycle, about 3 to 4 hours, including stops and depending on how fast you cycle. You could come back a different way and stop off and try a couple of the pubs at Wick if you wanted to avoid taking the exact same route back to Nash. As I've explained, I'm trying to cycle the entirety of the Welsh Coast, as well as walking and kayaking it. We approached Trwnewich Headland, which flanks Dunraven Bay on the eastern side, with its Iron Age hill fort, roundhouses and pillow mounds, which are remains of medieval rabbit warrens. The headland is called Trwnewich, probably because of its nose-like shape. Trwn means nose in Welsh. We paused again for another great view back eastwards along the cliffs. We climbed up to Dunraven Park, which over history became the location for a series of houses. In the 16th century, a grand house was built here by the Vaughan family. Then in the 19th century, the manor house was rebuilt as a Gothic mansion known as Dunraven Castle due to its grand castellations. During the Second World War, the building was used as a military hospital, and then the castle was demolished in 1963 after falling into a state of disrepair. Today, all that remains are parts of the walls that once surrounded a deer park, the impressive walled garden, and a folly tower. We paused on the cliff tops to take in the views over Dunraven Bay. In the distance, we could see the lively town of Porthcawl jutting out into the sea on a headland. Porthcawl is one of the bigger towns on this section of the coast, and is something of a small regional centre. As we came to the crest of the headland, we got our first view of the end of the walk, Southerndown. There are 3 car parks at Southerndown, the one on the beach, the overflow car park in the field you can see there, and there is also a pay and display car park which you pass at the top of the hill down to the beach. You have to pay at all 3 car parks. The only option for free parking is on the main road through the village of Southerndown, which is where we parked on this occasion. We descended down to Southerndown Beach, which as usual seemed to be very busy. It is one of the most accessible and popular beaches on this part of the Glamorgan Heritage Coast. If you want to park in the most convenient car park by the beach itself, then it is best to come here early at busy times. There are toilets and a snack bar at Southerndown Beach. As you can see, Dunraven Bay is another rocky and pebbly beach, typical of the Vale of Glamorgan. It is quite popular with surfers due to it being fairly exposed. On the couple of occasions that I have kayaked into Southerndown Beach, I have found it okay as a place to get out, as long as you are about 2 to 3 hours or so either side of high tide. From the beach, we climbed up a slope towards the pay and display car park, and then up a short section of road into Southerndown village. Looking back eastwards, True Norwich Headland was a dramatic backdrop to Dunraven Bay. The gradually setting sun started to cast a shimmering golden band across the sea, and it looked like we would get to the end of the walk before the sun set. The climb up from Dunraven Bay to Southerndown tested our weary legs since we had been walking for almost 4 hours already. Finally, we got back to the 3 Golden Cups at Southerndown at about 6:30 p.m, having started walking at about 2 p.m. After some quick refreshments at the 3 Golden Cups, it was back to the car a couple of 100 metres down the road to head home for a well-deserved rest. This walk ended up taking us just under 4 hours, although we were going slower than usual, and this included a lunch stop of about 50 minutes, so we were actually walking for about 3 hours.